a peaceful, successful, and prosperous future.
I've said it already, but it just going to emphasize how much has changed while Prince Philip has been in public life. It was later that he revealed how his sense of mischief had taken over during the celebrations, recounting his comments to President Kenyatta as the Union flag got stuck as it was being taken down.
The program went extremely well, but there was about a sort of minute's hiatus or something. and when the flag came down, we were just waiting for it to come down. There was complete silence everywhere. Everyone was slightly twitchy, wondering what was going to happen. I said to him, I said, well, are you sure you don't want to change your mind? And he grinned all over his face and said, no.
Aside from his work in supporting and representing the Queen in official duties, he worked hard to bring the institution of the monarchy up to date, helping to bridge the gap between the royal family and the people. No easy task, as former Prime Minister Edward Heath reflected.
Well, he realised that times had changed a very great deal and that monarchy couldn't be aloof. It had to be understood by people. People had to feel that they shared in it. But at the same time, it had to maintain their respect. It's all too easy just to mix with people. But to maintain their respect at the same time is difficult.
Some consistent themes coming through as we remember the Duke's life. As part of the modernising drive, he was behind a 1969 documentary. Many of you may remember it. It was showing the royal family at home, relaxing, and at work. He also promoted the practice of the walkabout, in which the royals met the public in the street. With no formal job, the Duke of Edinburgh focused his energy on areas of public life that he found interesting, becoming involved in conservation and the environment long before they were mainstream interests.
What I feel very strongly about is that mankind, by its activities, should not put whole species at risk of total extinction. You can knock down Westminster Abbey and rebuild it, but if you extinguish a dodo, you simply cannot bring it back. It's gone forever.
Well, on the line now is Martin Palmer, who worked with the Duke for decades in his capacity as a conservationist and head of the Alliance on Religions and Conservation. Good afternoon, Martin.
Good afternoon, Michelle.
How and when did you first come to know the Duke?
Well, by a series of very typical Duke of Edinburgh accidents, basically. I was asked by WWF back in 1983 to write the first ever book for schools on the relationship between religions and the environment, called Worlds of Difference. And because Prince Philip was the international president then of WWF, he read it. And I always used to say to him that because it was written for 11-year-olds and had lots of pictures, he not only read it, but got it. He actually understood that there was a whole world out there of faiths that, for a variety of reasons, deeply rooted in their teachings and beliefs, should be the natural allies for the environmental movement. And he then proposed that the 25th anniversary of WWF, to take place in 1986, should be on the theme of religion, which nearly caused apoplexy amongst the sort of conservation people who thought religion was nothing to do with reality and the real world. But he forced it through, and as a result, he and I organised and he hosted the first ever meeting of religious leaders on the environment in Assisi in 1986. And from then on, it just escalated, and he was always there, always saying, come on, this is really important. And basically, he was just the best possible mate you could have if you wanted to make a totally incomprehensible movement comprehensible.
That is really interesting, because you had that close insight. You saw him up front at a time when he was trying to do something that a lot of people just thought wasn't the right way to proceed. Was once he decided on something, did you have the sense of a man who was absolutely determined to make it happen?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, absolutely. If he felt it was going to make sense, yes. If he felt that it was going to be a waste of time or that it had been diverted, then I saw him kill off many initiatives which were basically talking shops. He had very little patience for that. It always had to be that there was a very practical, tangible product at the end. And the movement that he basically initiated, the one with the face around the world, the UN now describes as the largest civil society movement in the world on the environment. And it would not have happened if he hadn't been willing to talk to the president of the World Bank or to the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as be willing, for example, to host the Taoists of China when they were just recovering from massive persecution and give them the publicity that basically meant the Chinese government recognized they had a major environmental, spiritual source in their country that otherwise they probably would never have noticed. So no patience for things that were just talk shops, but a huge energy for things that would actually make the world a better place.
What was he like personally?
Well, we got on extremely well. I think mostly because I came in via the back door. Nobody screened me. It was all kind of accidental, really. And therefore, we had a very informal relationship. I would go and see him very regularly, and it'd just be a one-on-one conversation. And I was in touch with him at the beginning of this year because we did an act of worship for Radio 4 for Sunday morning at the beginning of January. He always had a very strong sense of humor. Not many of the jokes could I repeat in public, but they were great fun. He was immensely engaged in what was actually happening. He cared very much, but he also, and I think this was the greatest thing about him, he always gave you the feeling that he was delighted to be supporting something that you were doing, as long as you did it well, rather than that he was in charge. He never, ever hesitated in giving advice. We had some amazing rows and arguments because he liked to be challenged, not just kowtow to. In fact, the quickest way to lose his interest would be to kowtow. So we would have fantastic conversations and discussions. We would debate all kinds of things. He read so extensively. When he retired, I said, the thing that most terrifies me about this is you'll have time to read even more books and quote them at me. He just had an absolute delight in knowledge and information and putting it to use. And as long as you could go with that and argue if you felt differently, you would get his respect. But he was, quite seriously, to be honest, Michelle, one of the best mates I've ever had.
I'm sorry that we've had this news today, and that means that you've lost a friend. I get the impression from you of a man who enjoyed debate. Did he want to have his arguments challenged, to have his views challenged, to have that sense of a cut and thrust of a debate?
Very much so. And I mean, if you could prove him wrong, or if you could prove, not so much prove him wrong, Michelle, but if you could sort of say, there might be another way of looking at this, he would then listen, he would take it on board, and the next thing you would know is you'd be sent about 8 or 9 books that he'd read about the subject, which he thought you ought to read just to make sure that he is right or that I was right. So there was this great intellectual delight in ideas, debate and discussion. And I think that the strength of this was that if you could prove your argument, and on 2 or 3 occasions I actually won, he would then say, okay, I get it. I'm going to change my mind. And he just was, he also had very little patience for people who distorted. So there was a period when, because of the whole thing of religion and environment was seen by some groups in the religious world as being sort of paganism, I came under a huge amount of personal attack. And he actually made the most extraordinary thing of going on record and doing an interview saying, I don't agree with everything that Palmer says, but I think what he's trying to do is jolly sensible, so lay off. And it was that sort of approach, a real hands-on, a real sense that there were important things to be done and ephemeral things could be put to one side.
Martin Palmer, thanks for talking to us today about your long association and friendship with the Duke of Edinburgh.
It's 1:20, and a reminder, if you are just joining us, that we're reporting across BBC radio networks on the news from Buckingham Palace of the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. We heard Martin Palmer there talk about his genuine concern for the environment before it was fashionable. We'll hear just a few more words from the Prince. We've been playing you clips of him talking about himself. The Prince was particularly concerned about population growth and its effect on the planet, and he explained that in 1998.
I think we're teetering on the edge. I mean, you think that there are 3 times as many people alive today compared to the year that I was born, for instance. So the human population is probably the most important. If we can get that to level off, at least we've got a breathing space. But if it goes on growing, I mean, there's nothing you can do. You can simply delay the moment when there's going to be a catastrophe.
Prince on population growth. We can talk now to Charles Anson, who was press secretary to Her Majesty the Queen from 1990 to 97. Charles Anson, thanks so much for joining us on this day, and maybe what you are thinking at this point.
Well, I think it's the loss of an outstanding man, an outstanding consort to the Queen, and someone who had not only a great many ideas, but also an ability to translate them into action. But his first duty always was, of course, to the Queen.
To what extent, in terms of the kind of managing something, the news of this kind, is the palace ready for this, do you think, prepared to take us through the next week as the nation mourns the passing of the Duke?
Well, I think this is a very long and distinguished life, and clearly everyone has been expecting it to happen at some point, but you're never completely prepared. The shock of losing someone who has contributed so much and who has been at the Queen's side for all these years is something that is always difficult to absorb for anyone who's followed his life and his life with the Queen all these years.
Tell us about your experience, your dealings with Prince Philip as press secretary to the Queen in the 90s, Charles.
Well, what was so striking about Prince Philip is that he had an independent mind as well as a great sense of duty. And often those two things don't go together, but they went together very well in him. His support for the Queen and his ability and wish to have a life of his own and to contribute to public life in a way that was supportive to the Queen. A man of ideas and also a man of action. I mean, an absolute polymath in terms of his distinction in the Navy, his contribution to the environment, his interest in ideas, in industry, in faith, voracious reader. But above all, someone who wanted to get things done. That applied as well within the family. He was very much a father and a husband who steered family life, obviously in support of the Queen all the time. But he had his own range of interests and his own relationships with his children and an ability to think of the future and what their future was going to be, what the future of Britain was going to be.
Did he cause you trouble as press secretary, Charles? I mean, people will remember, of course, what I suppose we might call the irreverent comments, the plain speaking to you.
Well, the plain speaking was often amusing. It was never intended to offend. Occasionally it did by mistake. But his ability to talk to people, to break the ice, and especially, with the Queen, who was a more retiring person by nature, he had this great ability to make people laugh and to enjoy things. And with it, of course, a very serious side to him. And I found as press secretary, his challenges on the way we were handling something were always extremely constructive. They may come across as critical, but his intention was always to try to be helpful and try to move things forward. He was very committed, I think. I felt all those 7 years that I worked for the royal family. He was very committed to making a better world, and he has made a better world. He's made a better world for young people. He's made a better world for the services that he was so much a part of. And in many other areas, both his ideas and his ability to translate them into action was outstanding. And he had also, with that slightly rough tongue occasionally, he had a great gentleness. He had a great gentleness with his children. He was obviously trying to help Princess Diana at the time of the difficulties in the marriage. And he tried to move things forward in a constructive way, whether it was privately or publicly. And that strange mixture, unique mixture of gentleness and also a man of action.
One of the things, of course, is, I mean, so many people will have had a brief encounter with the Duke of Edinburgh in the course of their life, probably a very much more memorable day for them than for the Duke. But a lot of them do talk about how a true professional at handling that, let's call it the small talk, and the ability to make people feel very special, even though, of course, he's countering thousands of people in that way.
He could be very funny, he could be very informal, but he could also be very challenging. He liked to challenge people's ideas. He enjoyed the discussion, he enjoyed the debate. So I think of him not just as a polymath, but also something of a Renaissance figure, love of books, love of ideas, an interest in faith, an interest in being challenged himself on his own views. And surprisingly, I found he was an extraordinarily good chairman. He always gave everyone at the table a voice, and equally at the same time, he led things, but not in a very unhurried way that gave people a chance to talk.
Charles Anson, press secretary to the Queen from 1990 to 1997. Thank you very much for talking to us.
There are many tributes to Prince Philip coming in from overseas and of course here overseas, including the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison amongst those foreign leaders reflecting on the death of the Duke. Scott Morrison says he embodied a generation we'll never see again. Earlier we heard the Prime Minister saying that he helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so it remains an institution indisputably vital to our national life. And Sir Keir Starmer saying he'll be remembered most of all for his extraordinary commitment and devotion to the Queen. Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent, is with us here in this studio. It is nearly a century of life, Johnny. Take us back to the very beginning and those extraordinary events of his early years.
I mean, the word extraordinary will be overused when we remember these times, but by golly, what a life he did lead. I mean, he was born in Greece at a time of incredible ferment. This is in the years after the First World War. All around him, monarchies had fallen during the war. He was a prince of Greece, fairly far away from the throne, but to be affected by that because he was going to be exiled from Greece, age 1, transported in an orange box onto a British destroyer, and then pretty much dumped at Brindisi, the Italian port, a night train from Brindisi up to Paris, and then this extraordinary peripatetic existence that he led, bouncing from school in France to Germany, and then to England, his family breaking up, his father going off to Monaco, his mother going into effectively an asylum. She had quite severe mental problems for a while. His 4 sisters all being married off within the space of a year. All this happened in 1 year. His family just disappears around him, and he is effectively adopted by relatives in England, in immense good fortune there. But he was a penniless prince in a fairly inhospitable Europe, and it forged him in many ways because I think it led to him becoming quite a private man, ironically, in this very, very public role. You know, the few biographers who got close to him got an awful lot of snorts, and I'm not sure why you're interested in that, and that kind of thing. And it led also to him looking for a home, and he found one in the Royal Navy. And that was the first place that he went as a professional after he left school, after he left this extraordinary school, Gordonston, up in Scotland, where he learned the values of both outdoor life and individualism. But then to the Navy, into Dartmouth Naval College. Most people in Dartmouth Naval College had spent years in there before they graduated. He spent, I think, about 6 months and graduated top of his class. So this was his passion, this was his love, and the Navy was his one spoken regret about joining the royal family. It's one of the very few times he said he had any regrets, and he said yes, just one, the Royal Navy.
Because he was clearly a cadet and then an officer of tremendous ability and caliber.
Yeah, he was. I mean, and his war record speaks of that, not just being mentioned in dispatches, but he had guile, and he had ability, and he had leadership. Yes, he was talked of as someone who could go right to the top. There were some who said that perhaps his temper might have actually stopped him getting right to the top. He drove his men very, very hard. There's no doubt about that, that they loved him and admired him as a part of it. But in the end, he had to choose between the beautiful young woman, the beautiful princess that he married, and the Navy that he loved so much. And of course, it would be the princess, the Queen, that he chose.
And then the 73-year marriage ensued. Johnny Diamond, thank you very much.
The Press Association very helpfully given the Duke of Edinburgh's life in numbers, including the 73 years that you mentioned, Michelle, 54 presentation of colours, 32 service appointments, 4 children, 8 grandchildren, 10 great-grandchildren, 14 books authored, 5,496 speeches given, 22,219 solo engagements from 1952 to August the 2nd, 2017, when he officially retired from public life. It's now 28 minutes to 2. You're listening to a BBC News special as we remember the Duke of Edinburgh, who has died. The news came at noon. We'll now join Tom Sanders for a summary of the news.
Buckingham Palace has announced that the Duke of Edinburgh has died, aged 99. The statement spoke of the Queen's deep sorrow at the death of her beloved husband. It added that he'd passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle, and the royal family were joining with people around the world in mourning his loss. The Duke had returned to Windsor Castle just over 3 weeks ago after spending a month in hospital, his longest ever stay. He'd been admitted with an infection but then underwent heart surgery for a pre-existing condition. The Prince, who was just 2 months away from his 100th birthday, has spent much of the COVID-19 crisis staying with the Queen at Windsor. They were married for more than 70 years, making him the longest-serving consort in British history. Martin Palmer knew the Duke well. He worked with him for decades in his capacity as a conservationist and head of the Alliance of Religions and Conservation. He said Prince Philip was one of the best mates you could ever have.
He always had a very strong sense of humour. Not many of the jokes could I repeat in public, but they were great fun. He was immensely engaged in what was actually happening. He cared very much, but he also, and I think this was the greatest thing about him, he always gave you the feeling that he was delighted to be supporting something that you were doing, as long as you did it well, rather than that he was in charge. He never, ever hesitated in giving advice. We had some amazing rows and arguments because he liked to be challenged, not just kowtow to him.
Prince Philip dedicated decades of his life to royal duty before he eventually retired from public engagements in the summer of 2017. Speaking in Downing Street, Boris Johnson said the Duke helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our normal life. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said the UK had lost an extraordinary public servant. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon extended her deepest condolences. Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, said the Duke had served the Crown with selfless devotion and generosity of spirit. The Conservatives, Labour and other political parties have suspended election campaigning. The Commons will sit on Monday afternoon to pay tribute. International leaders have been expressing their condolences, including the Prime Ministers of India, Australia, New Zealand and Ireland. The former US President, George W. Bush, said he was mourning a man who'd represented his country with dignity.
Tom, thank you for that. A day of historic significance for the royal family, for the UK, and of course for the Commonwealth. Political leaders have been paying tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh this afternoon. Let's listen again to what the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on the steps outside Number 10 in Downing Street.
Prince Philip earned the affection of generations here in the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth and around the world. He was the longest serving consort in history, one of the last surviving people in this country to have served in the Second World War, at Cape Matapan, where he was mentioned in dispatches for bravery, and in the invasion of Sicily, where he saved his ship by his quick thinking. And from that conflict, he took an ethic of service that he applied throughout the unprecedented changes of the post-war era. Like the expert carriage driver that he was, he helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life. He was an environmentalist and a champion of the natural world, long before it was fashionable. With his Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, he shaped and inspired the lives of countless young people, and at literally tens of thousands of events, he fostered their hopes and encouraged their ambitions. We remember the Duke for all of this, and above all, for his steadfast support for Her Majesty the Queen, not just as her consort, by her side every day of her reign, but as her husband, her strength and stay of more than 70 years. And it is to Her Majesty and her family that our nation's thoughts must turn today, because they have lost not just a much loved and highly respected public figure, but a devoted husband and a proud and loving father, grandfather, and in recent years, great-grandfather. Speaking on their golden wedding anniversary, Her Majesty said that our country owed her husband a greater debt than he would ever claim or we shall ever know. And I'm sure that estimate is correct. So we mourn today with Her Majesty the Queen. We offer our condolences to her and to all her family. And we give thanks as a nation and a kingdom for the extraordinary life and work of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
Boris Johnson speaking in Downing Street a little over an hour ago. Well, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has also spoken in the last hour.
Well, the UK has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. He dedicated his life to our country. And above all, I think he'll be remembered for his support and devotion to the Queen. And all of our thoughts are with the Queen, the royal family, and the British public as they come together to mourn this huge loss.
Well, you're listening to special programming across BBC networks from BBC News, and we will, of course, bring you more reaction as it comes in this afternoon.
The statement that came from Buckingham Palace read, "It was with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh." Sarah Bradford, historian and royal biographer, is on the line. She's the author of Queen Elizabeth II, Her Life in Our Times. Good afternoon, Sarah.
Hello.
One can only imagine the void that this leaves in the Queen's life.
Well, can you imagine being devoted to somebody for so long, having a wonderful relationship with somebody for so long, and then they disappear out of your life? Yes.
How would you characterize their relationship?
Well, I think it was one of the best marital relationships you could have. They loved each other from the start. They appreciated each other. They understood what each other's position was. Sorry.
And they saw these extraordinary changes in their time together, for the country, of course, but then the growth of their own family.
Yes, but I think that's the great point about them. She fell in love with him when she was only 15. 13, says my husband. But anyway, that's a long time to be devoted, and they were. And I think that the way that he developed his side of the family and the way he dealt with young people was wonderful. So there was an inspiration in his role.
And how involved was she, and how important was it to her that he find a role that he was comfortable with?
Well, as you can imagine, you wouldn't like to have an uncomfortable Prince Philip as a husband, would you? And I think that it just all clicked perfectly for her and for him and for all of us.
How would you say that that things developed from that early period? I mean, they would have really liked to have more time, wouldn't they? As a relatively normal married couple, they spent some time in Malta together when he was still serving with the Royal Navy. All of that was cut short.
I suppose so, but then you have to remember, the Queen always knew she was going to be the Queen. Prince Philip always had an idea of being royal. And I think that it just worked out as they would have liked.
How involved